In the summer of 1683, the fate of an empire stood silently before the walls of Vienna. For nearly 2 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had advanced across Europe as an unstoppable force, toppling kingdoms and reshaping the balance of power. Now, at the gates of a single city, that long momentum hesitated. Vienna was not merely a fortified capital, it was the threshold between 2 worlds, between imperial expansion and irreversible decline. What unfolded outside its walls was not just a failed siege, but the moment when confidence turned into overreach, strategy into miscalculation, and conquest into retreat. From this battlefield onward, the Ottoman Empire would no longer define Europe's future, it would struggle to preserve its own. Ottoman strategy and the balance of power in Europe before the siege. By the late 17th century, the Ottoman Empire remained one of the most formidable political and military powers of the early modern world. Its borders stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, and from the Caucasus to the shores of North Africa. Yet beneath this vast territorial reach lay a strategic mindset shaped more by inherited confidence than by a sober reading of Europe's rapidly changing balance of power. The road to the Second Siege of Vienna was paved not by sudden ambition, but by long-standing assumptions about Ottoman supremacy and European fragmentation. For much of the 16th and early 17th centuries, Ottoman expansion in Europe had followed a consistent pattern. Campaigns were designed around overwhelming force, psychological dominance, and the exploitation of divided Christian states. Hungary, the Balkans, and large parts of Central Europe had fallen not only because of Ottoman military strength, but because European powers rarely acted in unity. Rivalries between the Habsburgs, France, the Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth, and various German principalities created strategic openings that the Ottomans skillfully exploited. This legacy of success fostered a belief within the Ottoman elite that Europe, though technologically advancing, remained politically incapable of sustained cooperation. By the 1670s, however, this assumption was increasingly outdated. European states were undergoing significant military and administrative transformations. Standing armies, improved logistics, standardized drill, and more effective use of artillery were reshaping warfare. At the same time, diplomacy was becoming more sophisticated, allowing rival powers to temporarily set aside their conflicts in the face of a common threat. The Ottoman leadership, particularly under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, underestimated the depth and durability of these changes. Ottoman strategic thinking before the Siege of Vienna was driven by both opportunity and ideology. The Habsburg monarchy appeared weakened by internal revolts in Hungary and Transylvania, while ongoing tensions between Austria and France limited Vienna's diplomatic flexibility. From Istanbul, the situation resembled earlier moments of European vulnerability. Capturing Vienna promised not only territorial gain, but symbolic domination over Central Europe, potentially forcing the Habsburgs into a subordinate position and reshaping continental politics in the Ottoman favor. Yet the Ottoman strategic apparatus was no longer as cohesive as it had once been. Decision-making was increasingly centralized in the hands of powerful Grand Viziers, while the Sultan's direct involvement in campaigns had declined. This shift placed immense responsibility on individual commanders, amplifying the consequences of personal ambition and misjudgment. Kara Mustafa Pasha envisioned Vienna not merely as a military objective, but as a political trophy that would secure his legacy. This personal dimension subtly influenced strategic choices, prioritizing a decisive and prestigious victory over caution and flexibility. Meanwhile, Europe was beginning to perceive the Ottoman advance not as a series of regional conflicts, but as a civilizational threat. Papal diplomacy played a crucial role in reframing the Siege of Vienna as a defensive struggle for Christendom itself. This narrative encouraged cooperation between traditionally hostile powers, most notably the Habsburgs and the Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Ottoman leadership, accustomed to European disunity, failed to fully grasp the implications of this ideological shift. Thus, on the eve of the Second Siege of Vienna, 2 contrasting strategic worlds stood in opposition. The Ottoman Empire advanced with confidence rooted in past victories, expecting Europe to fracture under pressure. Europe, though still divided, was learning to unite when survival demanded it. The imbalance lay not in manpower or weaponry, but in perception. The Ottomans marched believing history would repeat itself, while Europe prepared to ensure that it would not. The Second Siege of Vienna and the critical military failures. When the Ottoman army arrived before the walls of Vienna in July 1683, it did so with immense confidence. The campaign represented the culmination of decades of strategic pressure against the Habsburg frontier and appeared to offer a final opportunity to break Austrian resistance in Central Europe. Numerically superior and logistically experienced, the Ottoman force seemed well positioned for success. Yet the siege that followed revealed not the strength of an empire at its height, but the consequences of misjudgment, rigid command structures, and critical military failures that would determine the outcome long before the final battle was fought. One of the most decisive errors lay in the Ottoman approach to siege warfare itself. Vienna was among the most heavily fortified cities in Europe, protected by modern bastioned defenses designed to absorb artillery fire and resist direct assault. Instead of pursuing a rapid, forceful attack aimed at overwhelming the defenders, the Ottoman command opted for a prolonged siege. This decision was driven in part by Kara Mustafa Pasha's desire to capture the city intact, preserving its wealth and prestige. However, time became the Ottomans' greatest enemy. Each passing week increased the likelihood of European relief forces arriving, a risk that was acknowledged but insufficiently addressed. The failure to fully encircle Vienna further weakened the Ottoman position. Although the city was under intense pressure, key routes through the surrounding terrain remained inadequately controlled. Ottoman forces did not decisively block the approaches from the west and north, allowing Allied armies to assemble and advance with less resistance than expected. This lapse reflected both overconfidence and poor coordination among auxiliary forces, particularly the Crimean Tatars, whose role in reconnaissance and harassment was essential but poorly executed. Without effective disruption of enemy movement, the siege became a waiting game the Ottomans could not afford. Internal command problems compounded these strategic flaws. The Ottoman army, while vast, was composed of diverse units with differing levels of discipline and loyalty. The Janissaries, once the elite core of Ottoman military power, no longer displayed the cohesion and obedience that had defined earlier campaigns. Resistance to risky assaults, disputes over pay, and declining morale undermined operational effectiveness. Meanwhile, decision-making remained highly centralized, limiting the ability of subordinate commanders to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The reliance on mining operations beneath Vienna's walls, though technically sophisticated, also revealed critical limitations. Ottoman engineers achieved several localized successes, collapsing sections of fortifications and forcing the defenders into desperate countermeasures. Yet these breaches were not exploited with decisive infantry assaults. Opportunities to force a breakthrough were repeatedly delayed or abandoned, allowing the defenders to reinforce their positions. What should have been moments of maximum pressure instead became missed chances, further extending the siege and exhausting Ottoman resources. The culmination of these failures occurred with the arrival of the relief army in September 1683. Led by the Polish king Jan III Sobieski, the Allied forces launched a coordinated attack from the Kahlenberg Heights. The Ottomans, unprepared for the speed and scale of the assault, struggled to reorganize their lines. The famed Polish heavy cavalry charge shattered Ottoman formations, turning a prolonged stalemate into a sudden and decisive defeat. The retreat that followed was chaotic, marking not only the end of the siege but the collapse of the entire campaign. The Second Siege of Vienna was lost not because the Ottoman Empire lacked soldiers or weapons, but because it misread the nature of the conflict it had entered. Strategic hesitation, incomplete control of the battlefield, declining discipline, and an underestimation of European coordination transformed a position of apparent strength into a catastrophic failure. Vienna did not fall, and with it fell the illusion that the old methods of conquest could still guarantee success. The defeat of 1683 and the Ottoman retreat from Europe. The failure before Vienna in 1683 marked far more than the loss of a single campaign. It signaled a fundamental shift in the Ottoman Empire's position within Europe. For the first time since its rise as a continental power, the empire found itself not advancing, but reacting. The defeat shattered long-held assumptions about Ottoman invincibility and exposed structural weaknesses that could no longer be concealed by sheer military scale. From this moment onward, the balance of power in Europe began to turn decisively against the Ottomans. In the immediate aftermath of the siege, the consequences were swift and severe. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, held responsible for the failure, was executed by order of the Sultan. His death, however, could not restore what had been lost. The Ottoman army retreated in disarray, abandoning artillery, supplies, and strategic positions across Hungary. What had begun as a confident march toward domination ended as a defensive withdrawal, emboldening Ottoman enemies and undermining the empire's authority along its European frontier. The most significant outcome of the defeat was the formation and expansion of the Holy League. Encouraged by the victory at Vienna, Austria, Poland-Lithuania, Venice, and later Russia united in a sustained military effort against the Ottoman Empire. Unlike earlier coalitions, this alliance demonstrated endurance, coordination, and a shared strategic vision. Over the following 16 years, the Ottomans faced continuous warfare on multiple fronts, a challenge that strained both their military capacity and economic resources. Battles and campaigns across Central and Eastern Europe revealed a new reality. Ottoman forces, once feared for their mobility and discipline, increasingly struggled against well-trained European armies equipped with improved artillery and refined battlefield tactics. Key strongholds fell one after another. In Hungary and Transylvania, territories that had symbolized Ottoman dominance for generations slipped out of imperial control. Each loss further eroded the empire's strategic depth, forcing it into a reactive posture focused on preserving remaining lands rather than expanding influence. This prolonged conflict culminated in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, a watershed moment in Ottoman history. For the first time, the empire formally ceded large European territories through a negotiated settlement. Hungary and Transylvania were transferred to Habsburg control, while Venice and Poland secured significant gains. The treaty marked the end of Ottoman territorial expansion in Europe and established a precedent that would shape future diplomatic relations. The Ottomans were no longer dictating terms. They were adapting to a European system that increasingly favored their rivals. Beyond territorial losses, the psychological impact of 1683 was profound. The defeat undermined the ideological foundations of Ottoman rule, which had long rested on the notion of divinely sanctioned expansion. Military failure raised questions within the empire about leadership, reform, and modernization. While efforts to adapt would emerge in the following centuries, they were often reactive and contested, reflecting deep institutional resistance to change. For Europe, the Ottoman retreat confirmed a broader transformation. The continent was entering an era defined by centralized states, professional armies, and balance of power diplomacy. The Ottoman Empire, shaped by a different political and military tradition, found itself increasingly outmatched within this evolving system. Vienna became the symbolic line beyond which Ottoman power could no longer advance. The defeat of 1683 thus stands as a turning point of lasting significance. It marked the transition of the Ottoman Empire from an expansionist force to a defensive state struggling to maintain its European holdings. The retreat that followed was not immediate collapse, but a gradual, irreversible shift that would redefine the empire's role in European history for centuries to come.